Early summer 1944. Location, Camp 17, Scotland. A desolate, wind-swept moor, miles from civilization. The cold, unforgiving light of the North Atlantic summer beat down on the mud and makeshift barracks. This was not the battlefield, not the desperate, adrenaline-soaked hell of the Eastern Front, nor the terrifying, chaotic inferno of the skies over the Reich. This was the cage, and inside, thousands of the Wehrmacht's finest, or what was left of them, were held captive. They were prisoners of war, defeated, stripped of their weapons and their purpose. But their war of observation, a silent, almost involuntary campaign of curiosity, was just beginning. In the meticulously ordered world of the Nazi state, appearances were everything. Discipline, precision, and an almost religious adherence to uniform and bearing were the hallmarks of the German fighting man. The prisoners, accustomed to this strict aesthetic, found themselves confronted daily with a puzzle, an enigma wrapped in tweed and perpetually lukewarm tea: the British soldier. The German prisoners, products of a hyper-efficient, highly militarized state, expected their enemy, the victor, to reflect a similar if not superior level of rigid professionalism. But what they witnessed, day after mundane day, defied their entire worldview. Their captors, the British Army Guards, seemed at first glance utterly unremarkable. They were to the Germans a study in what appeared to be military sloppiness. Buttons were frequently undone. The spit-shined perfection of their boots often yielded to a comfortable patina of dirt. Their discipline, though present, lacked the theatrical parade ground snap that the Wehrmacht considered essential to military identity. The British Guards smoked cheap cigarettes with a casual air, talked to each other in low, almost conversational tones, and often seemed more interested in the state of the local football league than the fate of the Reich. This apparent lack of intensity, this glaring, almost criminal informality, was the initial source of the prisoners' fascination. How could an army that looked so relaxed, so almost undisciplined, have halted the mighty blitzkrieg and now hold them, the supposed masters of military science, captive? This was the first great irony. The defeated were judging the victors on a set of standards that clearly had failed to secure the victory. But the most arresting, the most compelling sight was something far more subtle than a creased uniform. It was the movement. It was the easy flow of communication. It was the sheer baffling abundance of what seemed to be spare parts. A young Oberleutnant captured near Caen, a man who had been taught that the British Empire was a bloated, dying relic, wrote in his secret diary, "They have no fire in their eyes. They look like clerks on holiday. Yet when the convoy arrives, when the trucks appear, or when they are building a new watchtower, they move like a perfect, silent machine. They do not shout commands. They simply know." What the German POWs were witnessing, though they couldn't name it, was the fundamental difference between the totalitarian, top-down efficiency of the Axis powers and the decentralized, adaptable, and massively resilient infrastructure of the Allied war machine. They were looking at a reflection of the British nation itself, a system that could afford the luxury of individual eccentricity because the underlying industrial and logistical machinery was so robust and self-sustaining. They watched, not just to understand the enemy, but to understand their own failure. And what they began to observe was not just the behavior of the Guards, but the sheer, overwhelming wealth of materiel that flowed effortlessly behind them. Every patrol had a functional jeep, not a repurposed farm vehicle. Every rifle had ammunition in excess. Every new construction project arrived not only with the necessary wood and wire, but with an astonishing, almost arrogant surplus of everything. The German High Command had told them that the British were at the breaking point, that their economy was collapsing under the strain of U-boat attacks. Yet, these clerks on holiday possessed a staggering, continuous stream of resources that seemed limitless. It was a silent, devastating exhibition of industrial power, and this observation, the realization that their enemy was not just fighting better, but was equipped better on a scale they could not comprehend, was the true seed of doubt. The initial scorn for the sloppiness quickly curdled into a genuine creeping fear, the fear that they had not been defeated by a superior army, but by a superior civilization. This is the central mystery of our story. What was the true strategic component the German prisoners were observing, the thing that shattered their belief in the Reich, and what role did a single, unassuming British intelligence officer, a woman named Anna Weber, play in engineering this display? The answers lie not in the chaos of battle, but in the meticulous, almost mundane organization of the enemy's rear echelon. It is a story of logistics, psychology, and the terrifying power of industrial might. If this deep dive into the psychological warfare and logistical paradoxes of World War II intrigues you, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. In the next chapter, we'll delve into the precise propaganda that the German soldiers were raised on, and how the seemingly casual British behavior was designed to systematically dismantle it. The German machine operated on a philosophy of visible perfection. From the sleek lines of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 to the meticulous timing of the Blitzkrieg, the belief was that perfection in form, the sharply creased uniform, the rhythmic goose step, translated directly to effectiveness in the field. This was the propaganda of precision, a narrative drummed into every German soldier from the moment they put on their first uniform. The Allies, conversely, were painted as decadent, chaotic, and technologically inferior, a mongrel collection of nations relying on outdated equipment and poor discipline. This belief system was the mental framework through which the POWs initially processed their captivity. When they first saw their British guards, the immediate reaction was condescension. The guards were smoking, laughing, their posture relaxed. Everything the German soldier was trained to believe was a fatal weakness. "They look like they've lost the war, not won it," one prisoner reportedly scoffed. But condescension is a brittle shield. It cracks easily under the weight of sustained, baffling evidence. The psychological foundation of the German soldier was built on the concept of Führerprinzip, the absolute belief in top-down, unquestioned authority, and the belief that the Wehrmacht's structural hierarchy was the ultimate engine of victory. Their engineering philosophy, the one perfect weapon, mirrored this. A single perfectly crafted Tiger tank, it was believed, could stop 10 clumsy Shermans. A single brilliant plan from the High Command trumped the messy cooperation of a coalition. The British Guards, however, presented a stark and terrifying counter-example. The Guards rarely consulted a written order in front of the prisoners. They appeared to move, shift, and anticipate the needs of the camp with a minimum of fuss and zero visible panic. They didn't need to shout to communicate. A nod, a slight gesture, or an abbreviated word seemed sufficient. The prisoners, used to the strict, shouted cadence of German command, mistook this efficient shorthand for apathy. They were wrong. This was the silent, deep efficiency of an operational culture that valued decentralized initiative and mutual trust over rigid, hierarchical control. It was in the camp's perimeter defenses that the first real psychological tremors began. A German engineer, a corporal who had helped build sections of the Atlantic Wall, observed the construction of a new searchlight emplacement. He noted the British had not brought a specialized crane or a detachment of heavy engineers. Instead, a few men, seemingly without a dedicated foreman, employed a series of ropes, pulleys, and levers with an improvised grace. The German expected chaos, arguing, and mistakes. He saw none. He later recounted, "They were not fast, but they never stopped, and they never did the same work twice. There was no Vorsicht, caution, and no screaming. They seemed to trust the man next to them completely, even when the load was dangerously balanced. In our army, such a job would require a staff conference and 3 officers supervising. Here, a corporal and 2 privates made a cup of tea, solved the problem, and then smoked while waiting for the paint to dry. Their discipline was not displayed, it was simply applied. The irony was devastating. The German military had perfected the display of discipline. The parade, the salute, the pressed uniform, while the British had seemingly perfected the application of efficiency, quietly, competently, and with a shocking lack of self-importance. The most potent element of this display, however, was the food. The prisoners were fed according to the Geneva Conventions, adequate but rationed. The guards, however, were not secretive about their own mess hall. The smell of frying bacon, the sight of fresh vegetables, and, critically, the amount of variety in their diet was an assault on the German psychological profile. The prisoners, many of whom had fought on the Eastern Front, knew the reality of starvation, of foraging for rotten potatoes, of fighting for a single mouldy crust of bread. The Reich was starving, and its soldiers were dying of malnutrition as much as of bullets. Yet the British Guards were consuming what seemed to be a continuous feast. This wasn't merely good morale. It was a visible, sensory confirmation of the devastating failure of Germany's Totaler Krieg, total war, strategy against the Allied logistical dominance. The prisoners' initial curiosity, why are they so informal, was rapidly morphing into a profound existential dread. How can they afford all of this? And if they can afford this, what else can they afford to throw against us? The answer was a staggering, unprecedented level of industrial output. The very thing the German propaganda machine had promised was impossible. The British military was not just fighting a war, they were staging a continuous, low-key, and deeply effective exhibition of industrial superiority. The POWs were captive, and yet they were also the unwilling audience to the very real crushing reason for their defeat. And this exhibit was being managed by an invisible hand, a meticulous plan that began not in the War Office, but in the realm of psychological intelligence. The stage has been set. The prisoners are watching, their worldview crumbling with every cup of tea the British Guard nonchalantly consumes. It's time to introduce the architect of this psychological campaign, the woman who understood that the true battlefield was the minds of the defeated, Anna Weber. The intelligence officer in question was not a field agent, not a code breaker, and certainly not a parade ground soldier. Her name was Anna Weber, a German-born Jew who had fled Berlin in 1935. She was a Cambridge-trained sociologist and a brilliant, cold-eyed expert in industrial psychology, a field the Nazi regime had grotesquely misapplied to racial purity, but which Anna understood could be weaponized for strategic effect. Anna Weber's unique insight lay not in analyzing German military strategy, but in deconstructing the German mentality. She understood that the German worldview was a paradox, a belief in ruthless efficiency coupled with an almost desperate need for visible structure and hierarchy. The Nazi state was an enormous, complex confidence trick. If the visible confidence wavered, the entire structure would collapse. She was seconded to the prisoner of war directorate in late 1943, tasked with a seemingly innocuous goal: to study the behavior of high-value German prisoners for interrogation purposes. But Anna had a bigger, more ambitious target. She realized that the POW camps were not just holding facilities, they were laboratories of ideological infection. The defeated men, isolated from the Gestapo's iron fist and the propaganda of Goebbels, were highly susceptible to a new, powerful narrative, the narrative of inevitable defeat. Weber's thesis, radical at the time, was simple. The British should not display martial superiority, but economic superiority. The most demoralizing sight for a German soldier who had been promised a blitzkrieg victory and the spoils of European resources was not a tank, but a simple, abundant commodity. Her plan, codenamed Operation Hearthside, was subtle and devastating. It required no bullets, only meticulous attention to the mundane. Firstly, she analyzed the three key weaknesses of the German Totaler Krieg economy: logistics, morale, and standardization. Logistics, the abundance factor. Weber correctly identified that German industry suffered from a nightmare of non-standardized parts, bureaucratic bottlenecks, and a critical lack of raw materials. To counter this, she instructed camp quartermasters to deliberately display an unnecessary surplus of common items. When a broken window pane was replaced, the guards were to conspicuously bring 3 extra panes. When a few meters of telephone wire were required, a full brand-new drum was to be rolled past the wire fence. The message, silent but deafening, was, "We have so much, we can afford to waste it." Morale, the casual factor. She understood the German need for rigid, visible discipline. Her countermeasure was to encourage the guards to be deliberately casual. The sloppiness the German POWs found so fascinating was, in fact, orchestrated. Guards were rotated frequently to ensure they did not become too rigid. They were instructed to engage in non-military conversations, hobbies, family, sports scores, within earshot of the prisoners, demonstrating a civilian life that was not only surviving the war, but thriving. This shattered the German belief that the British were at the breaking point. Standardization, the simplicity factor. The German high-tech marvels, like the V-2 rocket, often suffered from over-engineering and complex non-interchangeable components. Weber instructed the camp engineers to conduct maintenance on their simple, rugged British vehicles, jeeps, trucks, utility vans, in plain view. The POWs, used to the agonizing complexity of their own vehicles, would watch as a British mechanic would fix a carburetor with a simple set of standardized tools, often taken from a single, organized box. This demonstrated a genius not of complexity, but of simplicity and interchangeability, the true basis of mass production. Anna Weber's own identity played a critical role. A POW intelligence officer who occasionally strolled through the camp was an anomaly, a civilian woman, often seen with a notebook, speaking perfect, unaccented German. The prisoners initially assumed she was a neutral observer or a highly placed sympathizer. In her carefully crafted brief interactions, she never interrogated the prisoners about troop movements or unit strengths. Instead, she asked seemingly harmless questions about their pre-war professions, as a farmer, a mechanic, an architect. Then she would offer a single, devastating piece of comparative information. "You are a master tool and die maker." Excellent. You understand the complexity of the V1 turbine. Tell me, do you think your factory in Essen could produce 1,000 of them in a month, given the shortages of chromium? The rhetorical question hung in the air, connecting the technical skill of the prisoner to the brutal, inescapable reality of Germany's collapsing supply chain. The prisoner, a man of engineering, could not deny the technical truth. Weber was not defeating them with a gun. She was defeating them with their own expertise. Operation Hearthside, enacted across key POW camps, was a masterpiece of strategic psychological warfare. The German POWs couldn't stop watching the British soldiers because they weren't watching guards. They were watching a continuous four-dimensional exhibit of the very reasons they were losing the war. The apparent sloppiness was a mask, hiding an industrial and logistical leviathan of unprecedented power. The true language of war is not the roar of artillery, but the silent, grinding logistics behind it. And for the POWs, the British Guards spoke this language fluently, through a series of mundane, repetitive, and deeply effective actions that, by contrast, highlighted the desperate scarcity back home. One of the most powerful psychological tools employed by Anna Weber's plan was the sheer baffling abundance of tires and boots. The Wehrmacht, particularly after 1943, was constantly struggling with maintenance. Rubber was a highly rationed, critical commodity. A single blown truck tire could stall an entire convoy. The German soldiers' boots, the famed sturdy jackboots, were often worn to rags, their leather cracked and patched, the result of fighting a war across 2 continents with a failing supply line. In Camp 17, the Guards' transportation and footwear were pristine, but not in the way the Germans expected. They were replaced. The prisoners would observe a supply truck pull into the compound with visibly worn tires. The next day, the same truck would roll out with a brand new set of matching deep-tread tires. The old tires were not patched. They were simply discarded to a designated scrap pile, a visible testament to the fact that replacement was easier than repair. This was a psychological earthquake for men who knew their entire logistics chain was predicated on repairing every minute item until it completely disintegrated. Similarly, the Guards' boots, though not always parade ground shiny, were always structurally sound. They were replaced with such regularity that the Guards never appeared to be wearing anything truly old. This wasn't just about comfort, it was a deliberate visual strategy. The British were signaling that the individual soldier's basic needs were not a luxury, but a logistical given, backed by an industrial base capable of manufacturing millions of such items on demand. A sergeant in the Panzer Grenadiers, a man who had walked from Stalingrad to the Dnieper, wrote, "I saw a British guard take a brand new pair of boots from the supply. His old pair was not destroyed, only dirty. He put them in a box. I asked a nearby guard in my broken English why. The British man said, 'Rotation, mate, can't have a good soldier worried about his feet.' I looked at my own boots, which I had stolen from a dead Russian, and understood. They win because they don't have to worry about the war on the ground. They only have to worry about the enemy. We had to worry about both." Another critical psychological weapon was paper and stationery. In Germany, paper, printing, and especially high-quality ink were strictly rationed. Documents were often handwritten, forms were reused, and maps were precious commodities. The British, however, were drowning in paper. The prisoners would see the guards filling out endless forms, seemingly pointless bureaucratic exercises, using stacks of fresh, crisp white paper. Every communication seemed to generate 3 carbon copies. Furthermore, the letters the POWs were permitted to send home were carefully censored, but the sheer volume of letters the British guards received, coupled with the open, casual reading of newspapers and magazines, demonstrated a freedom of communication and a resource availability that was simply unimaginable under the Reich. This constant, visible supply of simple things, rubber, leather, paper, was more effective than any propaganda film. It wasn't the tanks or the planes that convinced them they were defeated. It was the endless supply of the boring. Anna Weber's reports to the War Office emphasize this point. The German soldier understands being overwhelmed by superior tactics. He does not understand being defeated by superior organization. We must stop trying to impress them with our bravery and start impressing them with our boring competence. The sight of a British quartermaster throwing away a slightly dented tin of polish is a more effective surrender negotiation than any air raid. This deliberate language of the mundane had a precise, measurable effect. Interrogation records, reviewed by Weber's team, began to show a shift in the prisoners' focus. Early interrogations focused on ideology, on the Jewish conspiracy, or the superiority of German engineering. Later interrogations from the men exposed to Operation Hearthside shifted. They began asking detailed questions about British factory output, supply chain management, and the British national debt. They were no longer worrying about fighting the war. They were trying to understand losing the economic one. The psychological victory was complete when a high-ranking Luftwaffe general, captured after the bombing of his base, was brought to Camp 17. His first question, after being offered a cigarette, was not about Hitler or the Eastern Front. It was, "Where do you get your tobacco? We are told you ration it to a minimum. This is a very generous cigarette." The simplest commodities had become the highest form of strategic communication. The British were not just winning the war of arms, they were winning the war of goods, and every casual action by a British guard was a broadcast in the language of overwhelming industrial power. The shift in perspective was most pronounced among the captured personnel of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. These were the technical elite, the men who flew the Me-262 jet fighter and the Heinkel bombers, men who truly believed in the superiority of German technical genius. If anyone could resist the psychological pressure of Allied abundance, it was these proud engineers and pilots. But for them, the irony was the most bitter. The Luftwaffe's war was a tragic case study in German over-engineering. Their aircraft were magnificent on paper, often faster, more complex, and more advanced than their Allied counterparts. But complexity breeds fragility, and fragility requires a complex, constant supply of specialized components. This was the chink in the Luftwaffe's armor, and Anna Weber knew exactly how to exploit the POW's deep-seated technical knowledge to expose it. Weber arranged for a steady stream of damaged Allied aircraft to be brought near the larger POW camps for salvage. These weren't pristine, combat-ready planes. They were shot-up, battered wrecks, mostly Spitfires, Hurricanes, and P-51 Mustangs. The captured Luftwaffe mechanics, bored and highly skilled, were sometimes permitted to assist the British salvage crews under heavy guard. This was not slave labor, it was a psychological operation. The Germans were allowed to inspect the Allied aircraft up close, to see the anatomy of their enemy's defeat, and more importantly, the secrets of their persistence. What the German engineers found was initially disappointing. The Spitfire, though a beautiful machine, used a simpler, less powerful cannon than the German aircraft. The Mustang's construction was straightforward, even crude, in places compared to the meticulous internal wiring of a Messerschmitt. But the sheer rate of repair was the true shock. A British salvage crew with only basic tools could strip an engine or repair a wing in a fraction of the time it would take their German counterparts. The reason was standardization. The German aircraft had been constantly modified and improved, leading to thousands of non-standard custom-made parts. A fuel pump for a 1943 Focke-Wulf might not fit a 1944 model. This resulted in production bottlenecks, complex supply tables, and aircraft being grounded for months awaiting a single, specialized component. The Allied aircraft, by contrast, were built for mass production. A wing section for a 1941 Spitfire could often be fitted to a 1944 model. The parts were simple, robust, and completely interchangeable. The British could lose 3 aircraft, cannibalize them, and build one fully operational fighter in less time than it took the Germans to produce a single new part for their advanced, grounded jets. A captured Feldwebel, sergeant mechanic, who had spent 6 months waiting for a non-standard magneto for his squadron's Me-109, was given the task of moving a large pallet of spare spark plugs for the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. He stopped and stared. On the pallet were 2,000 identical boxed spark plugs. He was witnessing the fundamental flaw in the Nazi quality over quantity strategy. If quality cannot be replaced, quantity will always win. The irony deepened with the analysis of pilot availability. The British Guards, through their easygoing conversations, revealed that their pilots received extensive training with hundreds of flight hours before entering combat. The Luftwaffe, decimated by attrition and fuel shortages, was sending pilots into combat with barely 20 hours of flight time in their new aircraft, little more than advanced students. The Germans had created a weapon, their technically superior aircraft, that their industry could not sustain and their training pipeline could not man. The British, on the other hand, had created simple, rugged aircraft that their factories churned out by the thousands, and their training corps kept perpetually manned. Anna Weber's carefully leaked but seemingly casual conversations with these Luftwaffe officers focused not on dogfights, but on fuel consumption and production lead times. She led them to the inescapable mathematical conclusion: the Luftwaffe was not losing because of bad pilots. It was losing because its industrial philosophy was fundamentally unsound. The moment of ultimate irony came when a captured German ace, a Knight's Cross holder, witnessed a simple British transport truck being hauled out of the mud. Instead of a specialized recovery vehicle, the British used a standard mass-produced winch bolted onto a simple common lorry. The ace, watching the ease and simplicity of the task, reportedly muttered, "We built a perfect clock, but they built a perfect factory, and the factory builds more clocks than we ever could." The initial scorn for the sloppiness had become a devastating respect for the true quiet genius of Allied mass production. The POWs' fixation on the Guards was not about their personalities. It was about the reflection of a monstrous, inexhaustible economic engine standing silently behind them. The terror was not the sound of bombs, but the sight of a full pallet of spare parts. Anna Weber knew that her psychological operation would only be truly successful if the seeds of doubt were not just planted in individual minds, but allowed to become a self-sustaining psychological contagion that would travel back to the active front lines. The POWs, once defeated men, now had to become the unwitting broadcasters of Allied industrial supremacy. The conduit for this contagion was the Kriegi mail, the letters, strictly censored but still permitted, that prisoners sent home to their families and friends in the Reich. Weber's censorship team was instructed not to focus on military intelligence, which was rarely included, but on tone and detail. A letter that was overtly negative or directly critical of the Nazi state was immediately intercepted. A letter that was subtle, descriptive, and focused on the mundane was allowed through. The genius lay in the description of the Guards and the camp conditions. German soldiers, especially the high-value officers, would unconsciously transmit the very observations that had shaken their own worldviews. They would write letters that sounded innocuous but carried a devastating subtext to a German civilian dealing with rationing and the nightly terror of bombing. Example of a letter that would be allowed to pass. "The life here is strange. The Guards are not what we expected. They are very informal. They drink tea constantly and talk of nothing but their football teams. Today, one of them broke a shovel handle and simply went to the stores and took a brand new one from a pile of at least 50. He did not repair the old one. He left it in a bin. I think of Father's farm, where he must weld the same plough handle 3 times a season. It is a different kind of war being fought here." To a German military censor, this was harmless chatter about boredom. To the recipient, a wife in Frankfurt struggling to find a single potato or a mother rationing a half-inch of butter, it was a terrifying confirmation that the enemy possessed an obscene, incomprehensible abundance. The detail about the shovel handle, the sheer wastefulness of it, spoke volumes about resources the German economy could no longer access. This was the core of the contagion. Comparison by subtraction. The POWs were reporting what the enemy did not have to worry about. They didn't have to worry about broken equipment. They didn't have to worry about food. They didn't have to worry about replacing a cheap item. Anna Weber also implemented a program that she called Controlled Access to Failure. This involved selectively allowing the more articulate prisoners to hear censored but true news reports on the collapsing German morale at home, or the devastating effects of the continuous strategic bombing campaign. The German government was lying about the damage. The British provided a controlled, highly accurate dose of the truth. When the prisoners received a letter from home, complaining about having to walk miles for a tin of preserves, and then heard on the camp radio that the British had just firebombed a key synthetic fuel plant, the two pieces of information coalesced into a single terrifying picture of impending ruin. The psychological turning point was reached when the POWs began to conduct their own analysis, using the British Guards as their living, breathing data points. They observed that the Guards seemed well rested, often requesting transfers so they could return to the front. The German prisoners knew the reverse was true for their comrades. The front was a place of endless, grinding exhaustion, with men praying for a wound, any wound that would send them home. The Guards were not just winning battles, they were winning the war of sustainable effort. As the war entered its final brutal phases, the effects of Operation Hearthside became measurable on the front. Surrendering German soldiers, particularly those from units that had maintained correspondence with POWs, showed a marked decrease in ideological fervor and a keen awareness of Germany's industrial collapse. Interrogation reports repeatedly cited the phrase, often heard first in the POW camps, "We were defeated by the American factories and the British quartermasters." The prisoners who had initially scoffed at the sloppiness of the British Guards were now the unintended agents of their own regime's demoralization. They had been exposed to the undeniable truth. The British were not fighting a temporary, desperate war of defense. They were fighting a war of permanent, sustainable industrial superiority. The subtle, quiet spectacle of the British soldiers' daily routine had achieved more than 100 bombers. The air in the camp, usually thick with the low tension of captivity, was now alight with the nervous energy of liberation and an ending that had been, for these prisoners, a psychological certainty for over a year. The war was over. The Wehrmacht had dissolved. The Third Reich was dust. The profound question remained. Why had the German POWs been so transfixed by the British Guards? The answer, as engineered by Anna Weber, was that they were watching not a battle, but a clash of economic systems, a showdown between two vastly different approaches to war and organization, one hidden under a veneer of casual competence. The sight of the British Guards casually puffing on their cigarettes and replacing a worn-out Jeep tire without a second thought was the ultimate climactic proof of the Allied thesis. The German machine relied on brilliance, audacity, and the single perfect solution, the Tiger, the V2, but it lacked the fundamental foundation of sustained industrial production and logistical resilience. The British and Americans relied on simplicity, robustness, and, critically, quantity over fetishized quality. This difference was best captured by a final, observed detail at the moment of the camp's closing. The British Guards were packing up. They weren't carefully inventoried every single nut, bolt, and piece of paper. Instead, they were instructed to simply move the remaining large standardized stores, crates of spam, drums of fuel, boxes of spare parts, to other functioning sites. The small, non-essential and broken items were simply and conspicuously burned. A former Hauptmann captain of the Großdeutschland division watched the smoke rise, representing tons of perfectly usable but strategically uneconomical surplus. The final message was delivered. Our victory was not costly, it was merely an expenditure. The prisoners' initial observations, the undone buttons, the easy laughter, the lack of shouted commands, all revealed the ultimate irony of the conflict. The apparent sloppiness was actually a sign of confidence. The British soldier could afford to be relaxed, to be himself, to show humanity, because the system beneath him was utterly dependable, inexhaustible, and resilient. He was an individual within a functioning democracy, fighting a mechanized industrial war. The German soldier, conversely, had to be a perfect cog because the system beneath him was brittle, tyrannical, and prone to catastrophic failure. Anna Weber's Operation Hearthside became a landmark in the history of psychological warfare, proving that the mundane, when strategically leveraged, can be more devastating than the massive. It was a victory of sociology over savagery, of economics over ideology. She correctly diagnosed that the German soldier was fighting not just the Allied armies, but the crippling inadequacies of his own supply chain. By simply allowing the POWs to observe the effortless wealth of the British logistical system, the endless stream of new tires, boots, paper, and food, she exposed the confidence trick at the heart of the Third Reich. The empire of the Thousand-Year Reich was shown to be incapable of manufacturing a reliable, standardized shovel. The legacy is simple. The German POWs couldn't stop watching the British soldiers because the British soldiers represented the future, a future of mass production, standardization, and logistical supremacy that had utterly defeated the German past of over-engineering and centralized, brittle hierarchy. They were watching their defeat, not on a map, but in the hands of a guard who was merely lighting a cigarette with a casual, devastating abundance. The war was won, ultimately, not just by the courage of the infantry or the skill of the pilots, but by the endless, predictable, and boring competence of the industrialized free world. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the psychological and logistical battlefields of World War II. If the true unseen histories of the war, the technology, the strategy, and the human element are what captivates you, don't let this be your last stop. Hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss our next chapter on the secret war waged by factory workers and quartermasters. What hidden story of the war would you like us to uncover next? Let us know in the comments below.